Moving on, our next prestigious speaker, Shraddha Patnala, is going to help us understand another research design, the qualitative research method. Shraddha has done her Bachelor of Journalism degree from Rhodes University, South Africa in 2018. Her next milestone project, also at Rhodes University, was her master's research in developing digital health communication about the dangers of antimicrobial resistance from food sources for low literate end users. While she is currently a lead writer and editor of 6 international academic research projects, she also freelances as a digital content creator for local South African businesses. She has several publications to her name. Her achievements are truly inspirational and incredible. I'd now like to invite Shraddha to kindly take over.
Hi, thank you so much for the lovely introduction. I will try to keep this quick because I know the previous presentation took a fair amount of time. I will share my screen. Just let me know when you can see it.
Yes, ma'am, it is visible.
Awesome, thanks. Okay, cool. So I have been asked to talk about understanding minds and qualitative data in research. And I will be answering, I'll be answering these 3 questions specifically, and I will keep them short and to the point. First is, what is qualitative data? Second is, why should we care about it? And the third is, how do we get it? And in this last part, I will be sharing examples from my master's research that is currently under examination. Cool. So what is qualitative data? It is essentially non-numerical data used to understand the why and the how of a phenomenon that anyone wants to research. These are presented or sourced in the form of videos, in the form of text, and in the form of audio. And when you try to obtain such data, before you go straight to the methods, you want to look at the kind of approaches that are involved and the kind of angle you want to take to find the right kind of data that you need. So action research is of particular interest to me. So I'll give you that example here and in the case study at the end of the presentation. So as you can see, you've got a fair few approaches and all the things that they involve. And it's up to you as the researcher to figure out what kind of aspect you want to assess or evaluate or get feedback on. And these are some of the methods through which you can obtain qualitative data. Through observation, both covert and overt, through face-to-face interviews or telephonic interviews, focus groups, which are essentially small groups of the sample speaking to one another and to the researcher about their experiences and their opinions. It's very subjective in nature. And surveys and secondary research where you look at existing material and you assess and evaluate those. So now we look at the analysis. Now I won't go too much into detail here because I will be sharing actual examples of analysis so you have something to go on. But these are some of the kinds of analysis you can do on the qualitative data that you obtain. For me, thematic analysis is something that I have conducted recently. Have an understanding or interpret the data that you obtain and find out what people think and feel about the phenomena. That is the point of it all. Moving on, we ask now, why should we care about it? So before we dive into that, it's worth looking at the advantages and disadvantages of qualitative data. So we'll start with advantages. In terms of flexibility, the data collection and analysis can be adapted as the research progresses to suit any emerging trends. And then the other advantage is that it is conducted in the natural settings of the phenomenon. So it's not conducted in a lab, it's not conducted in any kind of controlled environment where everyone knows, or rather the researchers know what the variables are. I hear some construction in the background. Is this affecting your audio quality in any way? Can one of you let me know, please?
No, ma'am, it's clear.
No, ma'am, it's crisp and clear.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so then we move on to the meaningful insights. One of the best advantages of qualitative data is that it can develop and improve the current sort of products, environments, whatever it is you're researching about and want to know more about, you can improve it based on the feedback that you get. And the final advantage is that it generates new ideas. So part of obtaining qualitative data is to use open-ended questions whereby you let the responder, the participant, sort of answer and give context to their answer so that you understand why they're saying it and how the phenomenon affects them. So these new ideas are essentially the open-ended question responses that can uncover new information and leads, either for your own research, so you can expand it, or for future research for other projects. Moving on to the disadvantages. It is slightly unreliable because it is not conducted in a controlled setting. So there are too many variables at play, and there's a good chance that you will not be able to replicate it in the exact same way that you can with quantitative data. The issue of subjectivity crops up because as observers, as researchers, our interpretation of the data can vary compared to another observer's interpretation of the data. The subjective is subjected to our own sort of biases and interpretations, and that means it poses a disadvantage to the generalizability, which is the next disadvantage. So because the qualitative data and the kinds of sort of methods used to get it, you have to work with small samples and have to deal with high subjectivity. So you can't always accurately reflect on entire populations. So what works for, say, 10 people in a small group cannot work for the entire community from which they are found. And the last one is that it's very labor intensive, meaning that there is a lot of man hours or perhaps woman hours put into such work, both for creating the questions and making sure that you're not sort of informing or influencing the respondents' answers in any way, and all the way to the actual analysis, where oftentimes, because you are working so much with words, you have to listen to it, you have to read everything, and you have to manually sift through the information and find emerging themes as a person before you can use software to make the job easier. So those are the pros and cons. Now we come back to the understanding minds aspect of qualitative data and qualitative research. So we are being shaped in the modern society in the 21st century by highly targeted influences and a huge sense of individuality. So say 10 years ago, 20 years ago, when social media was not a thing, and I'm using social media as one of the examples of micro subjectivities. Macro subjectivity is where, 20 years ago, you would have thought as a collective about certain issues. So if, say, a researcher wanted to know about the quality of life in a particular neighborhood, they could ask residents and they would all have most likely similar things to say about it. However, now there's a lot of room for personalization and there's a lot of room for change and very rapid change. So things aren't the same, and therefore our choices and influences often affect the kind of answers that we give. So subjectively, it's become very micro rather than macro. So now we move on to the how. How do we get qualitative data? And this is where I will be sharing with you my master's research. So a quick sort of context about the research that I conducted. This was conducted during COVID, during the lockdown in South Africa last year. And the research was on creating and receiving evaluative feedback on 2 digital educational materials about AMR, which is antimicrobial resistance, from food sources, so from the meat and dairy and agricultural industries, and how it affects consumers, not farmers, not veterinarians. Like, those are people who can actually make a difference, but we're talking about consumers. And these consumers were low literate in that they either had a 10th pass or perhaps a diploma of some sort, but no higher education as such. And based on that information, I created something that they could access. So it was end user centered. Now I will be taking you through my master's from methods, results, and analysis in its entirety through these pictures. So there were 3 phases to my research. The first one was to conduct the sampling, and I'm sure based on the previous speaker's very informative presentation, sampling is something everyone knows. So this was the recruitment of participants and my conducting of the literature review. Second phase was briefing the participants and commencing the study. And here is where you can see the needs assessment in phase 2. This was conducted in to ensure both quantitative and qualitative data. So in my research, qualitative data took center stage. That was the priority. I wanted feedback and I wanted it in terms of their sort of emotional and technological responses to the 2 materials that I created. And the needs assessment was done first to understand what the needs of the sample and therefore the community was. Phase 3 was where I designed it and conducted the participant feedback. And PMAT and SAM are 2 quantitative sort of tests to understand whether some information or material was readable, understandable, and actionable. And the semi-structured interview focused entirely on obtaining qualitative data. So my research was combining quantitative and qualitative, but in this case, qualitative was center stage and quantitative complemented and supported the qualitative data. So these were the types of evaluation research used in my study. So the needs assessment was conducted. The formative evaluative feedback was conducted through PMAT and SAM and the semi-structured interview. And then the final was based on these evaluative feedback. I could offer recommendations for future implementation. Now, this is where it gets interesting. So if you remember from my previous slides, one of the ways to analyze qualitative data was through thematic analysis, and that is what I did here. I used a method of analysis called deductive thematic analysis, whereby I deduced themes from the data. And I had 5 main themes, as you can see at the top, and various sub-themes under each one. And each of these were sort of directing the questions that I asked my participants, all open-ended, but I wanted to know specifically about, say, for example, did they clearly understand it and why? And how could I have improved it if they didn't clearly understand it? If you look at appropriate for target audience, did it support their social values and the kinds of things that they find important? Was it suitable to their language and their culture? Because I was talking specifically to 2 Black isiXhosa women in rural Eastern Cape province in South Africa. So their ideas of, and then their values associated with meat and dairy were not dangerous. They were good values. However, once I had introduced antimicrobial resistance information, they suddenly had to be a little bit more careful about where they sourced their meat from, where they bought their dairy products and agricultural produce from. So these are the kinds of things that I wanted to know. And I asked these questions according to these 5 themes and various sub-themes. And then once I had the interview, the semi-structured interview data, I had it all recorded and transcribed. This is where the software came in really handy. I had to still, as I said earlier, as one of the disadvantages, I had to be the researcher to come and read all the sentences that they said, all the sort of feelings that they expressed, and make a sort of manual coding for each theme. So I had to, based on the 5 themes on the left-hand side, I had to highlight the most relevant answer to the theme and the sub-theme, and take like a similar but lighter color to identify the context in which that answer was given. So for example, this is what I did, and this I did on Google Docs. So it was safe, easily updatable, and always available to me on the cloud. And okay, so for example, I asked the question, when it comes to the video and infographic that I created and shared with the participants, what features made it easy for you to share, and what made it easy for you to keep? So then one of the participants said size was very adequate in that the file size was not something that took up a lot of space on their phone. And then that was the main answer. Then the context was highlighted in a lighter color so that I would know why they said it and how they feel about it. And the next participant pretty much said the same thing. They were both in the semi-structured interviews together. So I had, it was essentially a joint interview. So based on this and about 20 to 30 odd pages of transcription from the interviews from these 2 participants, I then was able to use in vivo, which is a thematic analysis software for qualitative data. It is really useful. But before I could use it, I had to do manual coding so that the software coding became, or like the automatic coding became easier. So here I basically used the same headings as I did in the themes and sub-themes so that I knew where each response had to be coded. And as you can see in the references column in the middle of the picture, there are various numbers. And these are all responses that link directly to specific themes and sub-themes. Again, if you would like me to explain this in more detail, please reach out to me. I'd be happy to do so. But I do want to keep moving on. And in the end, this was the PMAT and SAM scores, which were quantitative data that I told you about earlier. This complemented my semi-structured interview responses. And this was essentially giving the kind of data that could be easily and quickly understood and could track the progress of my materials and how well they were received and whether they were understandable, actionable, and readable. And that is where we end. If you have any questions at all, please let me know in the comments, in the chat, or you can email me via my website. I will put that in the chat. Cool. Thank you so much for your time. I hope you learned something new today.
Thank you so much, ma'am. We've definitely learned a lot today. Your session was very, very nice and apt and precise.
Thank you.
Thank you.